Welcome back. I hope you're all focusing. Take a deep breath. It's my delight to introduce our speaker, John McDarg. He's been a member of the theology department here at Boston College since completing his doctoral work in the psychology of religious development at Harvard in 1979. He's taught courses in integrating spirituality and psychology for students in religious education, pastoral ministry, counseling, psychology, and social work. In addition to his teaching responsibilities at BC, John is currently the first director of the new Center for Psychotherapy and Spirituality at the Massachusetts School of Professional Psychology. John is certified teacher of focusing, so you better pay attention. He trained under Dr. Joan Klagsbrun and the late Neil Hartmann. He was the keynote speaker and workshop leader for the third annual All-Ireland Conference on Focusing 3 years ago. And the theme was focusing and spirituality. On a personal note, that's a very dry description of you, John. I didn't write it. I'm reading it.
I wrote it.
You wrote it. But John is also a delightful character, and also, but more importantly than that, John has been very much involved for years in prison ministry and teaches a lot of courses at Norfolk Institution, and I've had the pleasure of going there on his behalf a few times to celebrate the liturgy with the prisoners, and they all speak highly of him. So that is a great accomplishment. So without further ado, John McDarg. Thank you, John.
I'm to wait till this gets on. Oh, it's on green. Some of you know, if you've ever studied in Asia, that you never begin a teaching without honoring your teachers, because all teaching is basically transmission, right? What we've been given as gift, we pass as gift. And I decided 32 years ago, when I crossed the river from Harvard to here, that I would always honor my teacher. And my teacher was an extraordinary Quaker scholar named Bill Rogers. He had studied at the University of Chicago under Carl Rogers, no relation. And he taught courses in pastoral care and counseling and pastoral psychology at Harvard Divinity School. And one time we asked Bill, what do you do to prepare for a day of listening to those beloved strangers who find their way into your office? And he gave two answers. The first was no surprise. He being a Quaker, he said, I sit in silence. I listen for that of God within. The second answer took me years to figure out as the brilliant response it was. He said, and then I listen to poetry. I read poetry. Because if you think about it, if someone is going to talk to you about their life, they never give you a case study. No one ever walked into you and gave you their DSM-4 rating, right? I'm a 36-year-old heterosexual white male, and Axis 1. They give you metaphor, right? They say, sister, I feel like someone just kicked me off a cliff into 32 feet of water with alligators. And so I decided that I would always begin by honoring that. So we want to turn this down a little bit? Ah, okay. Thank you.
Here. I don't know how much I
Thank
turned
you.
it down.
Okay. So how, maybe up a little bit more? Okay. Bob, thank you.
Yes, good.
Great, great. Who says a little bit of MIT at Harvard there? Thank you.
How many Harvard men to turn down the microphone?
4, actually. 1 to do the work, 1 to write a critical analysis, and 3 to do the press releases. Okay. So honoring Bill, I just wanted us to take a moment to draw a breath, give us a little space of silence. And into that silence, I want to share a poem by Rilke, which I think is a great way of launching us today. So take a moment just to notice we're here. You see, I want a lot. Perhaps I want everything. The darkness that comes with every infinite fall, and the shivering blaze of every step up. So many live on and want nothing, and are raised to the rank of prince by the slippery ease of their light judgments. But what you love to see are faces that do work and feel thirst. You love most of all those who need you, as they need a crowbar or a hoe. You love most of all those who need you, as they need a crowbar or a hoe. You have not grown old, and it is not too late to dive into your increasing depths, where life calmly gives out its own secret. You have not grown old, and it is not too late. I find that very heartening at 63. I think we're all here because we want to be used. We want to be of use, right? And we are surrounded every day by people who thirst for meaning, for significance, for a knowing witness. And often what stands in our way is the feeling of, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to give the answers that people are asking me for. And the primary supposition of this workshop is that our big job is not to supply answers, but to find a way of helping ourselves and one another to access what it is we may already know about our own truth, to find our way forward, not by having some smart person like ourselves tell people what we should do, but by enabling people to listen to what they already know. In many ways, this afternoon workshop maps right on to the wonderful workshop we were just listening to with Bob. I loved that workshop. As the father of a, yes, right. Second round of deserved applause. As a father of a just stopped being a teenager, 20-year-old, the difficult conversations I have all came flooding back to me. And boy, I wish I had done this 15 years ago. But since part of what Bob is teaching us is how to attend to the feelings that undergird all of our difficult conversations, one of the things we're going to be noticing is how to notice you even have feelings. I love your example, for example, of the person calling you and say, well, you give an announcement, and the immediate was, I don't do announcements. A little later, I have themes and variations on that immediate response, and then what it takes when you catch up to yourself and notice all that is going on underneath that. So I want to talk a little bit about what focusing is, what it isn't. And I think I want to begin with a person, rather than the historical introduction, which I will do in a minute, how this idea of a process that is not copyrighted, is something that all of us do, some of us all the time, some of us rarely, how it really got into the bloodstream of therapists, spiritual directors, folks actually around the world. But I want to give you my own personal encounter with it, because it may be exemplary. In the 7th year of my time at Boston College, a year before I was to come up for tenure, I was given a job offer of a teaching position at another university, which will go unnamed because I'm going to say some snarky things about it. But they made me a very generous offer, and I tried to make the decision the way any university-educated, rational person would. I made this list of pros and cons. Have you ever tried to make a decision that way? You know? And so I was trying to be very rational, because that's what we academics do. You know, we live from here up, right? Like the Harvard law students that Bob was talking about. And so I made my list. More money, more prestige. Now, when they unionized over at Harvard, they had little buttons called "You can't eat prestige," but, you know. But hey, you know, this was great. This was long enough ago that computers were just coming in, and they offered me my own big computer. Those, you know, back in the days when they were huge, you know. And so there were many more pluses. And of course, the big plus is they wanted me. You know, one of those 5 emotional needs, you know, affiliation, recognition. But something about that decision did not want to be made. There was no right, it wasn't falling off the tree into my hand. I felt very stuck in that decision. And so I called this very wise Jesuit who was then my spiritual director at BC, and I said, Dan, I'm struggling with this choice. I've gone to the vice president and said, can you move tenure decision up a year? He said, no. You know, if you choose to go to this other place, you'll have to do it not knowing whether you got tenure here or not. So I went in to see him. I showed him my list, and he said, that is not the way you make a decision like this. He said, I think you already know all that you need to know about this place, but you don't know that you know it. This felt like a Zen koan. You know, what is that? What do you mean? He said, why don't you try this? We're going to do a little thought experiment. Close your eyes, and I want you to imagine that you have resigned from Boston College and you're walking up the front stairs of this new institution on the first day. And I want you to pay attention to whatever arises in your body. Body? I have a body? I'm an academic, I don't know a body. No, just, you know, get into the fantasy, visualize it, and notice whatever you notice. So I sit there, and the first thing I noticed is I was having trouble breathing. I was actually feeling like I had to work hard to draw a breath. And then he asked me whether there was a word or a phrase or an image that accompanied that body sensation. In a few minutes, we'll talk about that as getting a handle. I was having a body-felt sense around this fantasy of walking into the school. And then I paused and said, well, I did have a little fantasy, but it's really crazy. He said, don't censor yourself, but welcome whatever arises. So I said, I imagine that as I walked in, there's this big basket full of gas masks. And in order to walk into the building, you have to put on a gas mask because there's poisonous gas in the hallways. Now, if you go into someone's classroom, the windows are open and they're nice people and you can take off the gas mask, but you can't get from office to office without a gas mask. And Dan said, you know, I think your body knows something about this institution that you're not acknowledging. And I sat there for a very long time, and then I began to realize that even though the higher administration were doing a full court press to rush me for this school, around the corners of every conversation there were junior faculty or graduate students who were saying, this is a really toxic atmosphere, a really toxic atmosphere. And so I called the dean and I turned it down. And then I had a moment of panic. I was thinking, you know, St. Ignatius says, if you're on the beam of the will of God, you should experience consolation without cause. And I was desperate. I made the wrong decision. You know, I called my partner at the time, and he said, relax. You have till 5 o'clock to change your mind. And I just allowed myself to surrender that decision, to give it over and say, okay, I'm going to trust this. Well, about a month later, actually, I got a call from a colleague of mine at another institution. She had been offered the job I had turned down. And she said, would you care to tell me why you declined it? And I said, I think what would be more useful is to ask you whether you've had any fantasies about this place. She was a Jungian analyst, and so she paid attention to dreams. So I said, so have you had any dreams about this? And she said, funny you should say that. Just the other day, I was taking a nap, and I had this dream, and I was at this school, in the school cafeteria, and I was at the top of a huge slide like they have in a water park on a little cafeteria tray, and I was about to plunge down this big dark hole. I said, well, you know, I think you should pay attention to that. No. She said, this is a great career opportunity. I really want to get back to this city. My husband has got a job there, you know. So she took the job, and I didn't hear anything from her for almost a year. In fact, it was almost a year to the week. I got a phone call from her. So I want to tell you what happened at the last faculty meeting of the year. And I don't want you to say I told you so. So what happened? And she said, I got up and said, this is the most racist, sexist, homophobic institution I've ever taught at, and she resigned. And there was a long pause, and she said, I knew that, didn't I? I said, well, you did, but you didn't know that you knew it. Well, what I didn't know is that Father Lush, my spiritual director, had trained with two remarkable then Jesuits, Ed McMahon and Peter Campbell, who had studied under a remarkable figure by the name of Eugene Gendlin, who I will put a little image up here. Gendlin and Carl Rogers at the University of Chicago collaborated in the 60s in a research project trying to figure out what predicted transformation in psychotherapy. Could you figure out who would actually change in some helpful way and who just stayed stuck? And they analyzed the transcripts of first therapy meetings and then looked at some measures a year or so out into the therapy, both self-report and other report, as to who actually was able to use therapy in a way that changed their life in the way that you hope you'll get if you're paying $150 an hour or whatever. And they discovered they could predict who changed by looking at the very first transcript. They discovered that change in therapy was not related to the theoretical orientation or the wisdom of the therapist. It didn't seem to be related to the content of the therapy. Folks who changed, when you looked at their transcripts, you noticed something interesting. They didn't come in with clear, precise announcements about what was wrong with them. They seemed to be kind of floundering at the edge of some kind of knowing. They'd start saying, well, Doc, you know, it's like I'm pissed off all, well, it's not exact. It's more like I don't know, I'm kind of disappointed. And they seem to be falling down somewhere inside themselves, groping to articulate something that they didn't quite know, but that was true about them. And Gendlin came to call this ability, the ability to access a felt sense, that all of us know more than we can say. And that often when we deal with the clear and precise ideas about the way it is for us, we manage to lose the inner intricacy and the knowledge, the wisdom that we are actually sitting on, as I did in that incident there. If I had stayed with the laundry list of pros and cons, cost-benefit analysis, I would have, a year from the day of entering the institution, might very well have stood up at the final faculty meeting and had the same kind of announcement. Gendlin felt that this was a skill, this was an ability that all of us had at least some of the time, and some of us live quite naturally out of it. When I teach focusing, some people know exactly right away what I'm talking about. Doesn't everybody do that? By the way, it tends more often to be women, but it's not entirely gender specific. Some of us who are intellectually trained, we have a real hard time noticing these things, and not just noticing, but paying attention to them, honoring them, allowing them to vote in our decision-making or our discernment about life. Gendlin capsulized this insight in a wonderful little epigram. Experience is a myriad richness. We think more than we can say. We feel more than we can think. We live more than we can feel, and there is still much more. So what he did is he was by background a phenomenologist, a student of Heidegger and Husserl, and he looked at the phenomenology of human thought and the deep substrata of all of our thinking. Remember Bob's slide about thinking and reasoning, thoughts and feelings. And feelings, by the way, as we'll talk a little later, are actually more foundational than emotions, you know, because it's really a whole body state that has tremendous complexity to it. Often when we come up with one feeling, it's actually not the whole of it. There's always more, as Gendlin says. And he said, I bet people can be taught, can be coached around learning how to give that deep attention to their knowledges. This, by the way, some of you hopefully are already making connections to the way there's a long tradition within Christian spirituality, Ignatian spirituality perhaps particularly, of attending to that way of that knowledge, noticing the flow of energies and passions and desires, and taking that seriously as data about how we're drawn, what's unfolding in our lives. So there are three big ideas in focusing that I want us to look at. This, by the way, is the book available out here or in fine stores everywhere, Amazon.com, wherever you want it, in which this is now in a new edition, in which he sort of lays this out in ways that he hopes are accessible to everybody. You don't need to be a phenomenologist to get it. Let me say what focusing is not. It is not concentration. Focus, you know. It's not those of us who are madly ADD, and I have a little piece of that. This is not about overcoming your scatteredness. There's a lightness to it, to focusing. It is not going for our desire in this sort of primitive way. What it is a body sensation that has meaning. A body sensation that has meaning. There is a wonderful line from an essay by David Rome that I think summarizes this well. Focusing is a practice of bringing gentle, interested attention to one's bodily felt experience. Think about the example I just gave there. I was sitting there, and Dan's invitation is, what do you notice, whatever arises? And notice it and allow it then to speak to you, allow it to pass into language. Bodily felt here means the nonverbal texture, affect, that lies before or below our conceptual formulations. It can be experienced as a vague body sense that is more than just physical. Often our body sense we have to sort out, is this feeling in my stomach the pizza I had, or is it saying something more to me? And I allow myself to unpack it, allow myself to notice how it might shift as I attend to it. It is the way our body is holding our particular situation right now. The bodily sense of felt sense, as it is commonly called, is not the same thing as feeling one's emotions. The felt sense lies beneath emotions like anger, jealousy, or desire. It is more subtle and less susceptible of naming. Felt senses are free of the storyline that accompanies an emotion. I'm angry because such and such happened. That's often the way we short-circuit our knowing, right? Is we think we know what it's about. Let me give you just one example. I was privileged about 3 or 4 years ago to be invited by a remarkable group of women, both women religious and women who are pastoral counselors, to be a companion facilitator for group spiritual direction. They called themselves the Sophias. Wisely, too. These were really wise. So I got to be an honorary Sophia, great honor. And at our very first meeting, there were to be 5 women there, and there were only 4. And the 4th woman, who was supposed to be there, didn't show up. And I realized that we couldn't get on until we had noticed how it felt to have this woman missing. And I said, so what do you notice? We got an empty chair here. What's going on here for you? And the first response was, one said, I'm angry. I'm angry that she didn't call. And I said, well, is that all that you are right now? Just notice. And each of the women began doing some focusing on what they were feeling. And underneath that anger, there was a texture of fear. Did something happen to her? Disappointment, concern. And then I said, in order to be able to go on and spend the rest of the morning here, maybe you need to ask, what do those feelings need? And they discerned as a group, individually and as a group, that what the feelings needed was to know that when we were done our first session, they were going to get on the phone, all of them, and call and find out what happened. And once they had identified that, then there was this felt shift, a kind of sense of relief. Oh, this is what we're feeling, or all of what we're feeling, and this is something we can do about it. Now, let's go down to business as the foursome. You can still play bridge with 4. You know, we're going to do our work. But that was a very important education, and actually an important way of beginning what's been a wonderful several-year process of meeting with this group, because it was allowing what was happening in the room to be real. My study of focusing has very much changed the way, by the way, I do not only therapy, but spiritual direction. Because too often spiritual direction is people reporting something that happened out there over the last month, and focusing has allowed something real to occur in the room and in the between in a way that has very much shifted the way we perceive. So focusing, as the handout, it's a natural skill. It can be discovered, but it's not invented. And was discovered by looking at what people are doing when they're changing successfully, repeating Gendlin and Rogers' big discovery. Now, if you're sitting there and thinking, I haven't a clue what he's talking about, we may need to give ourselves a little bit of an experience of noticing that we've got a felt sense going on. So I ask you to remember, have you ever woken up from a dream and you can't recall the content of the dream, but there's a sort of affect, there's an atmosphere that the dream has left inside of you? Okay? Now, most of us just jump out of bed and brush our teeth at that point. But have you noticed, or I invite you to consider, what would happen if you stayed in the atmosphere of this dream, the content of which you don't precisely remember, but notice how it's already inflecting the way you're about to move into the world. And sometimes if you stay with the atmospherics, the climate, you actually can discover elements of the dream and notice something that you're carrying. Okay? You walk into a strange room, and you're already making some pre-conscious decisions about where to sit, what feels safe, right? Not too up to the front, you know, that's a little too vulnerable, not to the back. We are all the time guided by our felt sense, and we're barely aware that we're doing it. Or you go into a restaurant, and if you're not overriding your choices by what you think you should have, you know, what's on your diet, or what would your mother approve of, you've dropped in and said, what am I hungry for? And often, by the way, we don't eat well because we don't pay attention. We override those choices, right? Or we get talked out of them. There's a wonderful group of clinical psychologists I started meeting with at Harvard many years ago at the old Ferdinand's in Harvard Square. We'll find out who's really been around if you remember Ferdinand. And what I loved about those people is they ordered dessert at lunchtime. And I thought, this is great. Because I had, in my very strict German Catholic family, you never order dessert in a restaurant. We'd be looking at it longing, and we'll have ice cream at home. So we override often our own knowing by other kinds of voices that intrude themselves. So how do we get a sense of this felt sense? Let's try one. I'm going to do a kind of experiment here. I'd like you in a moment to close your eyes. I'd like you to visualize someone you would really love to see today. Someone who today, and again, not someone you think you should like to see, but someone that you would really delight to spend time with. Let's take a moment, and I think it's helpful to close your eyes for this one. See whether you can evoke the image of someone you really would delight to see. Raise your hand when you've identified somebody. Okay. Okay, hands down. Now I want you to imagine that when you walk out of this door at the end of this break, there they are. Somehow Star Wars technology or Star Trek technology, they've been beamed down, there they are. And notice what happens in your body as you go out, and there they are. And you blow off the rest of the conference and go off and have coffee with them or something. What do you notice? Pay attention. Maybe there's a word or a phrase identifies what it's like to spend time this afternoon with this person. So the visit is over. You thank them for showing up. And you open your eyes when you're ready. Sorry to cut the visit short. Okay. Now, what I'd like you to do just a moment is say to the person next to you, find someone to talk to, just what you notice. You don't have to identify at all who you saw, by the way. The great thing about focusing, my teacher, Joan Clegsburn, used to say it's Gestalt therapy for introverts, because you can do this work without ever actually talking about the content. You can actually be guided through a focusing process and never reveal to the other person what you're actually dealing with. Just have their help walking through the process of accessing this inner intricacy. So just share with whoever is sitting next to you, around you, just what you noticed in your body, and if there was a word or phrase. And just take turns, just very, very quick, you know. Talk with the person about what you noticed. And let the person you're sharing that with just say back to you what they heard. Is this mine or yours? It must be mine. Okay. 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 So make sure both of you had a chance to share. Yes, please. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So do you feel you were able to articulate a felt sense? You notice the difference? Now, if we were really going to carry this on, I would have you visualize the person you would least want to see in this moment. And then you could contrast the feelings. But I think, let's stay a little upbeat on this one. But notice, right? And let me ask you, how was it to have someone listen to you? And did anyone actually have your listening partner just reflect back to you just what they heard you say? Did you do that? If in focusing companionship, which we'll talk about, that's the job of the listener. The job of the listener is simply, and Carl Rogers was the great influence in this, is to hear what you're saying and try to reflect back to you what you're sharing so that you can see whether or not it's accurate. Well, what I hear you saying is you felt excited. Excited. No, it's more like ecstatic. That's the word. That's the way I was feeling. So we need a kind of knowing witness who, again, doesn't interrogate. Why do you feel that way about your mother? But we need someone to know that we are seen and heard. I want to say a word about, I've been thinking a lot about knowing witnesses, maybe also in the context of this kind of conference. The year after the clergy sexual abuse scandal here in Boston, there was a fellow who took up a 40-day vigil out in front of the chancery. Maybe you saw him on Commonwealth Avenue. It was in the middle of summer. Every day he was there. And after about the second week, I would, if I was going by and I'd stop at the store 24, I would just bring him a thing of water. And we would just chat for a few minutes. And I gave him my card. I said, if you ever want to talk about anything, feel free to come by the Department of Theology. And he said, I may use this sometime. And about 3 months later, I got a call from him and he said, I need to come by. There's a piece of work I need to do. I just need you to witness. And he came by my office, and I asked him what would feel safe. Did he want the door open or shut? And he said, well, it's okay. Why don't you keep it shut? And all he did was sit on the floor and weep for half an hour. He never said a word. I never said a word. At the end of the time, he got up and said, thank you. I needed that. I needed to be seen. I have no idea what he was working on. I do have an idea what he was working on. But what he simply needed, and I think what we all need, is to feel someone is there as we do the work of dropping inside and accessing complex and difficult feelings. In focusing, there's something a little more interactive if one goes through the process by helping someone notice and stay with and get compassionately curious about what arises, which takes us actually to the second big idea in focusing. It's called the focusing attitude. Many of us are trained to regard our minds as enemies, as sort of scary places. Any of you know Anne Lamott's operating instructions? She has this great line in there. She said, my mind is like a bad neighborhood. It's always 3 a.m. There's broken glass, mad dogs, muggers, and dog shit. I try not to go there by myself. That, by the way, I think is part of what that knowing witness is about, is I try not to go there by myself. But the habit we have is regarding the contents of our mind when it arises, and here I'm going to sound a little Buddhist on you, with either attraction or aversion. Something arises, ooh, that's a great thought. Or, ooh, I can't believe I'm thinking about that. The focusing attitude is to regard everything that arises in our body-mind with a kind of compassionate curiosity, or Anne Lamott says, treat yourself like you're a well-beloved, mentally ill aunt. But it was actually the Sufi poet Rumi who captured this most wonderfully in his poem, The Guest House. This being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival. A joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still, treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and welcome them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. Now, the use of therapy, or the use of focusing in therapy or any human interaction is a process of modeling that kind of welcome and supporting one another in hospitality with that arising, because it regards everything that arises as potentially a gift to our understanding. There's a wonderful Buddhist teaching story that actually illustrates this point. Milarepa, great Tibetan Lama, is making a solitary retreat in this story. And these demons start showing up outside his cave, howling and shouting obscenities and so forth. And it's very distracting. Now, in the Tibetan understanding, everything out there is really a projection of our own mind. But he tries to get rid of them. He exorcises, in the name of the Buddha, go away, or whatever. They just keep coming and coming. So he calls for consultation. He prays to his own teacher, who shows up in a rainbow. That's the way people come and go in Tibetan stories. And he says, what should I do? I can't meditate. I just keep having these horrible demons show up. And his teacher says, look, this is what you do. Next time they show up, instead of getting angry at them and shouting at them, just say, come on in. Would you like to have some tea? Let's sit down and talk. And in the story, the demons come in, have tea, and they turn into devas, helpful guiding spirits. I think this is very useful as you think about prayer. I mean, there you are trying to be holy, and all of a sudden this, whoa, grade A, violent fantasy or sexual fantasy or who knows what sorts arising, and you like Milarepa, you want to exercise it. But maybe if you relate it, well, that's kind of interesting. What do you have to teach me right now? What does this say about how things are for me? Let's have a conversation. You may discover that, in fact, that's a path to a deeper, more compassionate familiarity with how things are for you in that moment. Does that speak? And that, of course, is also the way we regard someone who is sharing anything with us. Because we are so interpersonally attuned, right? This is what I think, one of the things I was getting from Bob's presentation, that it's the feeling subtext of what we're saying that is really being picked up. Let me tell you one of the places where I went, as Bob was talking, again, going back to my son, thinking about this little pericope of behavior the other day. I said, Sash, if you wanted a Kindle, because I discovered that he had done one last bit of high school work totally off of his cell phone. He had, I don't know how you read this damn thing, but he read all the science texts off his cell phone. So I said, I would be willing to get you a Kindle. And he said, well, Pop, if you really want to get me something, get me this really neat new phone that's got a Kindle app. And my first reaction is, no, I'm offering a Kindle, not a new phone. Okay? It was a little like, no, I don't make announcements at the end of class. And he said, well, thanks, and was a little bit crestfallen. And fortunately, we have a consultation. She doesn't arrive in a rainbow. We arrive at her office at MGH, talk every week, my partner and I, about how to do parenting with a child we adopted at 5 from Russia, who came with all of his own baggage. And I happened to tell this story, and I was cemented into the rightness of my position. My intentions were pure. Were they? And I was invited to notice, what was going on there. And it's complex, and I'm still in the midst of this. It's hard to talk about because this was just Thursday that very kindly the therapist said, I wonder whether there's a kind of edge of anger underneath that. You want him to be a particular way. Now, I have a son who's mechanically inclined 95%, and he is not an academic at all. And that's my day job. And so I'm wanting him, isn't this all of our issue with our parents? And everyone else is like, do you love the kid you got or the one, you thought? And I'm having to look and try to do some focusing on underneath that. No, I offered a Kindle, not an app, not a cell phone. Some way in which I'm really disappointed. I mean, there's some very complex stuff going on here. And it's hard to access because, as Bob reminded us, we've got identities. I'm not the kind of person who would behave toward my son the way my father behaved toward me, right? Like, it doesn't cogwheel down generation. So, we always teach the lesson we want to learn. I'm teaching focusing because that's what I've got to learn to do in order to really be present and available to the people I love. But if I had stayed within the surface of, well, this cell phone is probably $400 and a Kindle is only $125 and we don't have the money and, I've been very rational about it, I would have missed the way in which that whole interaction had a power dynamic to it. And there was things going on there that he was more attuned to probably than I did. That he was aware of the manipulation. And I was just trying to be a helpful dad, right? So the evaluative reactions to feelings are the most common alternative to friendly receptiveness. So the focusing attitude is to suspend judgment. Thomas Merton said the opposite of judgment is mercy. Regard our the contents of our arising awareness with great mercy, right? Sometimes clients have obvious critical reactions toward what they feel. And our job is not to pile on, right? Our job is to ally ourselves with a part of our friends, our clients, our parishioners, our directees, that really wants to be merciful, that wants to be generous, their own innate compassionate well-being. And finally, big idea number 3. There's a theory of change going on in focusing, and it's trusting the body's own forward movement and knowing process. Like it or not, the caterpillar in us really, if allowed to move forward, wants to be a butterfly. Okay. Now, this is a really, really interesting one because in some ways it's orthogonal to the way we think change is always extrinsic. Change is something that someone does to us or we submit to, but Genlin's big idea, and the reason I think, by the way, this was so simpatico to Jesuits like McMahon and Campbell, is that there's the idea that there is an unfolding process. There is that of grace in the way human beings are constituted. And that grace does not come upon us from the outside to take away our interiority and put something else in its place. One of the most awful things a nice evangelical friend of mine sent me is this little metaphor. She said, oh, this is so wonderful. She said, human beings are like pumpkins. The grace of God scoops out all the yucky stuff and we put the light of Christ inside. I was horrified by that. Scrape out all the yucky stuff. You know, the grace of God enables us to relate to our yucky stuff as the condition of possibility of our redemption, you know. Jews, by the way, are much wiser about this than the whole idea of teshuvah, of turning in Judaism, is that which we want to regard as awful, God says, oh, I can do something with that. You know, just come on, let's collaborate here. And there's a wonderful midrash on the formula for incense on Yom Kippur. One of the ingredients is galabinum, or devil's dung. It's this absolutely foul-smelling stuff. And the rabbis wonder, as they wonder about every last detail in Torah, so why is this an ingredient? And their midrash, their commentary on that is, we need that stinky stuff. God needs it. And that in conversion or teshuvah, that actually is integrated. So the lustful man becomes the great artist. The avaricious human being becomes the treasurer of the temple. All those things that we don't think they need to be scooped out and gotten rid of, if we attend to and work with, collaborate, if you will, with grace, that actually is the condition of possibility of us really becoming whole. And so there's a very different attitude. And the idea then is that change happens from the inside out. There's a lovely little story of a Zen master in New York who decides to have fun with the guy who's selling hot dogs there in Central Park. And so he comes up to this guy, the hot dog vendor, and the Zen teacher says, "Make me one with everything." So the guy, you know, gives him a hot dog, you know, with chilies and mustard and sauerkraut and everything, and gives it to the Zen master. And the Zen master gives him a $20 bill, and the guy pockets it. And the Zen master, wait a minute, you owe me change. And the guy says, Zen master, change comes from within. That's the big idea, you know, change comes within. Genlin says here, a person is not a thing or even an organism, but a carrying forward, a going interaction with the environment. And that this interaction has a conatus or intentionality, moving forward to a place that is more life-enhancing and actualizing. And this was Roger's big idea, a kind of organismic vitality, that human beings have a natural tending toward their own healing and wholeness. It's why Leo O'Donovan, in his wonderful book, The World of Grace, on the theology of Karl Rahner, said, you know, that nature is graced. Gratia perfectit naturam. Grace builds upon our human nature. And in some ways, this kind of confidence that if human beings can pay attention to and learn to lean into the direction of their own wholeness or healing, that's the service we owe, is to ourselves and to one another, is to help make that happen. Couple more. How are we doing on time? What is our?
16, 17 minutes.
Okay. I will let you meditate on the body's next step here. But those passages, one from Iberg and the other from Anne Weiser Cornell, I ask you to think about, you know, what is the wisdom of the body, and find examples from your own experience. Because what I'm saying, don't take it in my word, you know, just see whether actually this resonates with your own experience of when you trusted the body's knowledge to you. I think in many cases we would have been a lot better off in our church and our world if people who had intuitions, which are often, by the way, dismissed as, well, that's just woman's intuition, right? Intuitions, you know, that new youth worker we got, something about it that I don't trust. We need to, oh, no, look at this great resume. And, you know, the Corey came out fine. And it's just, but often we pick up, because, as Jenlin argued, we are located in environments. We are exquisitely attuned to the interpersonal fields. That's what makes us human. We can lose that ability. It can be squashed out of us. When people grow up in environments where the only safe way is to pay attention not to their feelings but to mother's or dad's feelings. I did a long-term psychotherapy group for many years with gay men from alcoholic families. And these guys, all of them were exquisitely generous, amazingly attuned to what everybody needed. And the way you could panic one of these guys is say, what would you like to do tonight? I don't know. Because they had grown up in families where the way they felt about things had no voice. Their survival depended, as one guy said, I need to know when Dad walked in the door within 2 minutes. Was he drunk or sober? If he was drunk, was he happy drunk or angry drunk, mean drunk? And so all of his attention was out there reading the environment, but very little space for knowing what it was that he was feeling in that moment, right? Because there was no one there to witness and receive his feelings. And it's been argued that the helping professions are disproportionately represented, or the folks who grew up, who've been the priests and therapists and healers of their families, you know, we make our day job doing that. And that often means we override knowledges like, am I really exhausted here? Am I burned out? What do I need in this moment? Can you guys recognize sort of a little of that? Okay. So focusing is a way of dropping down inside and attending to that. Let me just say one word about focusing and faith, and then we'll just walk through some of the steps of focusing. Campbell and McMahon, in their book, now in a second edition, Biospirituality, Focusing and Way to Grow, argued, and this is what that whole presentation in Ireland that Tommaso referred to was about. By the way, focusing got into Ireland largely through women religious and men who had studied in the United States with people like Campbell and McMahon and brought it back. And what's wonderful about focusing, it's a very democratizing way of thinking about how people help one another. Although some people can make a living as focusers, training other people or making that an element in their own therapeutic repertoire. Essentially, relationships, focusing relationships can be between any two people who agree to be servants of one another's knowing in that way. A word about focusing as salt therapy for introverts. When I was studying focusing, you always had a focusing partner, and once a week, either over the phone or in person, you'd have a conversation. I got 20 minutes, my partner got 20 minutes. And sometimes you would say, this is specifically what I'm working on, you give the details. But on another occasion, I remember thinking, I don't really feel safe talking about what this is about, but I need help walking through it. And we had a wonderful focusing conversation where the individual walked me through the steps that in a few minutes I'm going to show you. And he didn't have a clue what I was talking about. And that was okay, because it really helped me do the work. And then it was his turn, and I did the same thing for him. But their big idea is that human beings, and the reason they felt Chardin was so important, that human beings are adapted by evolution to see themselves and experience themselves as a process of unfolding in relationship to their environments. And that the holy, the divine, God, however we talk about God, is not somehow up there, the static, unchanging prime mover. Steven Spielberg's The Force, or wherever you talk about it. God is really the dynamic process in which we live and move and have our being that is always inviting us toward the more. And my rabbinic friends point out to me that this is the true name of God. If you look at the revelation from the burning bush, God says, "Who shall I say send me?" And God says, "Ehyeh asher ehyeh," which we often translate as, "I am who am." It becomes the basis of all kind of metaphysics. The more proper use of the Hebrew there is, "I shall be there, however I shall be there." There's actually no present tense in biblical Hebrew. There's only past or future. And it's, I shall be there. In other words, that we are always living on the lip of the unveiling of new things. C.S. Lewis says the best experience of prayer is you get up and say, "I never knew before." Something new arises, because something is always new arising in our body in relationship to our environments. And that's part of the big idea in focusing. So what does it actually look like to do this? We're going to maybe do just one exercise. I'll explain to you how to do one exercise, because we have to be over by 3. We got 10 minutes. Thank you, Thomas. 10 minutes. I'm going to explain to you this exercise and do it on your own, as opposed to the demonstrations say, "Don't do this at home." Go do this at home. Okay. Clearing a space is perhaps the most helpful first step, and if you never do anything more than that, you've done a good bit of work. All of us are besieged by a sense of muchness going on all the time. In focusing, the first thing you do is you sit down and you allow your attention to drop inside, almost as if you had a little flashlight. You're going down in the basement and saying, what stands between me and feeling just okay right now? What stands between me and feeling okay? And you notice, what are you carrying? What preoccupations, fears, or concerns? And very respectfully then, you ask, well, could I set this aside for a few minutes? Can I, as it were, visualize taking that concern or problem, packaging it up and setting it what seems like an appropriate distance from you? And you keep on doing that until you have a little sense of spaciousness. Okay, well, let's see, there's the work I need to do, and there's this argument I had with my dad, and there's, there they all are. But I am more than the sum of my problems, right? So clearing a space is also a way of setting things at a kind of distance. And then you ask yourself, okay, except for that, do I feel, how is it? And allow yourself maybe to feel the freedom of being there with your, as Wendell Berry said, my tasks lying around where I left them asleep like cattle. There they are, okay. Then in a focusing process, you say, now of those things, what one feels like I want to befriend and spend some time with right now. I'm in this moment. God, I can't go to that one. That's too big. But that argument I had the other day that I really need to go back and look at. And you allow yourself then, as it were, to take that back in. And you ask yourself, how am I holding that? What's the whole of that about? Again, it's not analyzing the problem situation to its component pieces. It's not about getting smart. It's about getting wise, about befriending it. And noticing how you're carrying it in your body. And see whether there is any arising sense of a word, a phrase, a gesture, an image that articulates what that is about. So when I was doing this work the other day, it's just begun, when I came upon the word disappointment about what was underneath my, no, you can't have a cell phone, I want you to have a Kindle. And I said disappointment. I had a felt shift, a body sort of, oh yeah, that's it. There's disappointment. Now, to carry that forward, resonating, is disappointment in? Does the body say, yeah, disappointment's it? Then I could say, would it be okay for me to explore disappointment? What all is disappointment like? How does disappointment feel to me? And I might ask it questions like, what do you need from me right now? Disappointment? What's the worst part of it? And I could begin to discover new things. Like some edge of disappointment is also embarrassment. You know, I live in Newton, where the modal way, which people introduce one another, is, well, how's your son doing in college? Or, well, they get into Stanford, or do they get into Dartmouth? You know, and I'm saying this like, he graduated from high school. I think he's going to be a great electrician if he can get a job. So part of disappointment is some kind of way in which I'm attached. My identity is attached to having something to say in those kind of conversations. And so then I could get curious about that without judgment. Bad dad, you know, okay, why or how it is that I carry that need to come off in that way. What would it be like if I let that go? Could I experiment in my mind of rehearsing? Well, actually, he's not going to college next year. He's going to do this. And what would that feel like? So keeping it company is hanging out with yourself, allowing your own wisdom to have a conversation back to you, asking it something about what it needs. What would be the next small step? The wonderful thing about focusing is, Jen said, we're always making baby steps. Now, what's the little thing that it needs? So I've been thinking maybe the little thing that my son needs is to say, do you want to revisit that conversation? I've been thinking about the app and the Kindle, and you know, maybe I responded too quickly to that. Tell me how about this would be? Tell me a little bit about that cell phone. Get curious about why that's important. I don't know. I didn't bother to ask. You know, I started right out there. Let me pause a minute. What is all this? I've talked too much at you, but where does this begin to generate some insights? Or what kind of questions or musings do you have as we're talking this? Yes, please.
This is my first time sitting and focusing, but I've read extensively about Buddhist Eckhart Tolle and the rest. I was amazed that what you're expressing is things that I've read, like recognizing your identity, turning around and realizing, giving yourself permission to observe your identity, how you hold yourself, how tightly bound you are to your identity, being able to observe that from a separate space. And then Rilke wrote in, what was it, Seeds of Contemplation, 61, before he had his big affair, that there's a third sense, the spark of the divine, that can actually witness both of those.
Yeah, beautiful.
I was actually amazed that you didn't bring in, you know, the Buddhist teachings. These are like 2,500 years old.
Absolutely. When you go on to, the best resource is www.focusing.org. There's a whole section there, Focusing and Spirituality, and you go into it. Most of the essays are actually focusing and mindfulness practice. Because, in fact, you're absolutely right. There's some way in which Buddhist mindfulness practice has been onto this for 2,500 years. Where focusing is different is that in classic mindfulness practice, you notice it and you go back to your breath or whatever stabilizes your attention. Focusing is a suggestion about how you might go back to what arised and explore it in a particular way. But there's actually wonderful essays on that site by Buddhist teachers on how mindfulness practice and focusing can actually work together. In fact, at Mass School of Professional Psychology, we're going to, at the end of the month, Joan Klegsbrun, my teacher of focusing, and Charles Styrone from the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy here in Boston are doing a day-long workshop on focusing and mindfulness practice and how these really can cogwheel, because they absolutely are complementary practices. And the only conversation they often have is a little like Ogden Nash's, do you bathe before shaving or shave before bathing? It's kind of a guy thing. Do you do mindfulness practice before you focus, or do you focus in order to clear space in order to do mindfulness practice? But they are complementary, Peter. You're absolutely right. Yes, please, in the back. Oh, okay. It's I should have put that in. Mass School of Professional Psychology, MSPP. And it's coming up at the end of the month. It's a Friday, I think it's the last Friday in the month. You can probably find it on the MSPP website, but if not, drop me a email. I have the most no-brainer email address is my last name, which you've got, at bc.edu. Just drop me an email and I'll send you the information on that. Okay. Someone, yes, please.
I thought this was a really intriguing intersection between what you were talking about, John, and what Bob was talking about, and where this lands on the ladder of inference, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how you have, what this means for relationships sometimes, because sometimes there's something that you know, and it feels almost below sex experiences. So if you are trying to make observations, sometimes if you press yourself, you can do it. It's subtle, but it's about body language, or it's about tone of voice, or it's about things that don't happen. But sometimes it's ineffable. Sometimes it is, and so I guess I'm not sure if my question might be to you, Bob, which is what are you doing that?
Do you want to, Bob, I'd love for, actually, if you could speak to what you heard today that makes the connection for you.
I mean, for me, like, I mean, this is kind of off the ladder. I mean, I think of this as being off the ladder. Can you hear me? I think of this as not on the ladder. I mean, this is, oh my gosh, I have so many microphones. Okay. I mean, I experienced this very much more in the kind of second and third conversation of feelings and identity. The latter is like a tool for the what happened, and
But this is sometimes about what happened. And it's, sometimes it's something that you see that you cannot change. And something you or experience.
yeah,
And I don't want to
Yeah.
spend more time in that.
Yeah.
because I would place it as at the level of experience of something that's happening.
yeah. I mean, I'm struggling. It was really interesting, the kind of mindfulness. I mean, a few years ago, we actually had, the Harvard Negotiation Law Review did a conference on mindfulness.
Mm-hmm.
And there's actually a symposium issue of the Harvard Negotiation Law Review on mindfulness. And I mean, we know, so we kind of have this sense in our field, which, is kind of very detached from the rest of the law school in some way, that there's something really important here. But I kind of feel it's a little over my head.
Well, we're really at a growing edge because so much conversation that takes place is all at the level of talking heads to one another. I did have the great joy of being on the board of trustees for a Quaker elementary school in Cambridge, where our son went. And the Quakers are really very smart about things. You're there in the board of trustees, you're having a furious conversation, and someone, usually one of the wiser Quakers, will realize that you have galloped ahead of all the feelings in the room. And they'll say, I call for silence. Now that's radical. In the middle of a business conversation about budget, to create a space to notice what is going on, what is speaking in the room, and allows you in that moment to detach a bit from the ego-driven, my ideas have to prevail, to notice, is this of the Spirit? Is this of the light? Is this of God? Try that sometime when you're getting in a really furious argument with your spouse or your pastor, whoever says, I think we just need to sit here in silence for a little bit. And us type A personalities, we just go crazy. But, I learned in time to deeply honor what Quakers have learned about meetings, human meetings. Okay, thank you very much.